Good day, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I am very proud to welcome you to this edition of our 2022-2023 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series. The lecture series is supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA Brain Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Data Science, and through grants from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. Since 2016, the Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series is focused on the use of data science methodologies, artificial intelligence, deep learning, and statistical modeling as they pertain to differing themes in the biomedical and health sciences. This year's theme is data science and the public health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, where each Friday we listen to talks from leading thinkers about the issues, promises, opportunities, and hurdles associated with understanding the secondary health effects of COVID-19. These include delayed health checkups and treatments and mental health and drug abuse, increased obesity, and the long lingering health effects associated with this terrible virus. Indeed, our 2022-2023 application cycle is now open and will be for only a few more days. And so time is running out. We really encourage you to, if you're a junior faculty member working in this space or working in spaces such as infectious diseases, epidemiology, clinical medicine, population health, as well as data science, machine learning, AI, and statistics, and other relevant domains, to please consider applying. I've doing this for a while now, and we believe this is a very exciting and engaging program. We're characterizing the secondary health effects this year. Characterizing the secondary health effects of COVID-19 really necessitates unique quantitative approaches, but also new multidisciplinary collaborations. The participants selected for our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program will leverage presentations like we're about to hear as vital material for our culminating in-person grant project development workshop to be held at the Lodge at St. Edwards Park in Seattle, Washington in June of 2023. So today I am delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Vinay Pai from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Pai is one of our mentors this year for our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab, and he is a digital health specialist within the Digital Health Center of Excellence at the Food and Drug Administration's Center for Devices and Radiological Health in the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation, part of the Division of Health at the FDA, and he's been there since September of 2019. Vinay has his PhD in mechanical engineering from Florida State University and earned a Master's of Business Administration from Johns Hopkins University. Currently, he is focused on horizon scanning for new digital health technologies, evaluating existing and emerging digital health technologies, and helping to develop strategies for how to evaluate them. Prior to his time at the Food and Drug Administration, Vinay was at the National Institutes of Health, first as a staff scientist in the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and then as a program officer and division director for biomedical imaging informatics and health informatics at the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. Before the NIH, Vinay was a faculty member at New York University School of Medicine, developing techniques using proton and hyperpolarized helium magnetic resonance imaging to study cardiac and lung function. In continuing with our 2022-2023 Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series, Vinay's lecture today is entitled, "So You Want to Market Your Regulated Digital Health Device in the United States?" FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health recently established the Digital Health Center of Excellence to provide regulatory advice, guidance, and support to the FDA's regulatory review of device software functions. A large number of early-stage digital health products struggle to get to the U.S. market due to the perception of difficulty navigating the CDRH regulatory processes. Vinay is going to walk us through the various pathways for bringing digital health devices and technologies to market in the United States. He's also going to highlight the guidance documents within the digital health and medical device portfolios, which can help and be useful during the process of moving digital health technologies from prototype to real-world deployment. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. And if you are watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. Also, our specially selected 2022-2023 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants and alumni are encouraged to submit any questions they have for Dr. Pai via the chat feature in their Zoom sessions. I will synthesize these questions and ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of the lecture. And with that, Vinay, welcome. We are so excited to have you here speaking to us today. So excited to have you as a mentor, and we are really looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Thanks, Jack. Hope you can hear me well, and you can see my slide. Yep. Thank you. Thanks again for the introduction, and I'm going to jump right into the presentation because it's fairly extensive. And my presentation is going to focus the way I'm planning on doing this by showing some background content on the agency and the technology that we're working with before doing a deeper dive into guidances that are applicable for digital health. When you talk about the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, it's a regulatory agency, and the key word there is regulatory. And our responsibility is protecting public health. The agency does this through regulating a wide range of products, as you can see here, which range from like human drugs and biological products, animal drugs, medical devices, tobacco products, food, cosmetics, and radiation-emitting electronic products. And obviously, the gamut of activity is so vast that it's not run out of one center. There are several centers within the FDA which are responsible for regulating these various aspects of the agency. And these are mentioned on the left and the right of the screen. And we also have additional centers like the Oncology Center of Excellence. So when you look at CDRH, which is one of the centers, as I mentioned, it's the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And this is a center focused on medical devices. And it goes without saying that patients are at the heart of what we do. And our center's vision, as articulated by Dr. Jeff Shuren, and is that we want to ensure that US patients have access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance and first in the world. So we shouldn't be lagging in having these devices come to the use of the US public and patients as soon as possible. I wanted to switch topics a little bit, going from looking at an agency perspective to start looking at what do we mean by digital health technology? Because obviously, when you come from an academic setting, you have a pretty broad spectrum of things. And so when we think about digital health technologies, we see these things as convergence of computing power, connectivity, sensors and software that are used in healthcare and are applicable over the spectrum of healthcare, as you can see from on the top, where you can see from healthy living all the way out to like managing disease or treatment, and having how patients are utilizing these technologies in their treatment and care. This can also either be used as medical products or be used to study a medical product, or either be incorporated into a medical product like a combination product, or can be used as a companion or adjunct to a medical product, including diagnostics and therapeutics. So taking a little bit further on this axis, it's like when you look at the solutions that are coming out in digital health, and the landscape is pretty broad. And if you look at it, we are not only thinking about moving the healthcare from the clinic to the patient, but we're also trying to understand how behavior and physiology is being impacted or looked at in the real world versus looked at in controlled clinical trials, right? And so digital health gives us a lot of power in understanding some of these aspects that we had difficulty doing before. And if you look at the type of solutions that we're seeing come out into the marketplace, they've ranged quite a bit from like wearables, where you look at like sleep apnea monitors or neurological monitors, and like telecare, which is like activity monitoring, which has been pretty useful for like pandemic conditions, as you know. And also thinking of things like health and wellness solutions, where companies are coming out with approaches for improving different functions and trying to make sure that these devices can help the US patient population as much as possible. And the diversity also gives us an interesting challenge, because basically, while we're trying to achieve this vision of US patients getting access to medical devices, public health importance first in the world, we also want to make sure that they are high quality and they are safe and effective. So balancing that, those two sort of competing interests is always important to be careful that we don't miss that target in that sense. So as you notice, the landscape is pretty broad and it's evolving very rapidly. And so in order to make sure that the agency was on top of things here, we launched in 2020 the Digital Health Center of Excellence, or DHCOE. And this was basically driven by our ongoing commitment to advancing access to digital health technology collaboratively. Our goal in the center is to empower stakeholders to advance healthcare by fostering responsible and high quality digital health innovation. And we seek to find ways to tailor our regulatory approaches that is fit for purpose for these emerging technologies, including like artificial intelligence and machine learning, which has obviously a huge potential to positively impact public health. We believe that this is a shared goal for all stakeholders involved in this space, and we are a partner and contributor in the overall ecosystem, and we want to foster responsible innovation to make sure that our standards of safety and effectiveness are met. From our perspective, the Digital Health Center of Excellence has three components in this addressing this goal. One is that we want to connect the work that's being done both inside the FDA and outside the FDA to other parts of the ecosystem. And secondly, we want to bring that knowledge together, creating a network that people can stand upon so that there's less duplication and we can drive synergy. And the overall emphasis of all this is to make sure that we can innovate, and that innovation, not just like new technology coming to the US population, but also make sure that this technology is safe and effective. These are some of the areas of focus. As you can see that it's a pretty broad swath of areas, and it's a sort of living document in the sense that obviously new technology is coming online as every day, and so we had to be on top of these things. And some of these are also cross-cutting to the technologies already out there, like real-world evidence is a area of active interest across the entire center and the agency. And also, this is not quite an exhaustive list, obviously, but we are looking at a lot of new and exciting areas of authorization, and looking at it from a pre-market and post-market space, like, for example, virtual reality and augmented reality, and also looking at AI, ML, and ranging from advanced manufacturing approaches also to patient-generated health data, or PGHD, as we talk about. So before we go down further into this very focused area of interest from a digital health perspective, I think it's important to make sure that we are all on the same page on some of the basic concepts, that how the agency looks at things versus how we may consider these words or concepts outside the agency or outside the scope of a pre-market authorization space. So the first thing is we have to be careful when you talk about a thing called a device or a product. So when the agency talks about a device, we are basically saying that a definition that comes to us from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Section 201H, and that's listed here in detail. And basically, I'm not going to read the whole definition, and you can read it obviously, but there's some key aspects to this definition, right? First of all, at the top, we are having these kind of content about what this thing is, right? Like it could be an instrument, apparatus, implement, and so on and so forth. But the other two aspects, the key aspects here, are the two bullets here. The first one is like, what is the intended use of this particular thing, which is going to be considered as a device? Well, if it is used in diagnosing a disease or curing, mitigating, treating, or preventing of disease, then it's a device, right? And so that's key when you come with a product to the FDA. What are you doing with that product? What is the intended use of that product? So that is one of the key driving forces, how we look at a device, how we look at a product, whether it's considered a device for us or not. And the second thing we look at is like, okay, what is it doing? Like, is it intended to affect the structure or any function of the body? And we're also delineating a device from a drug or a biologic, where we say that it does not achieve its primarily intended purpose through chemical action, right? So a device is not a drug. So we have to be careful about how we define these things. And so it also helps you understand which part of the agency your particular product might end up in, based upon how the intended use of your device or product is set up. And so you want to be careful when you're thinking about your product, when you're building a product, where you start from an academic circle to going out to a startup or to a company and saying, okay, this is what I want to do. Think about this definition clearly and make sure that what you're doing with what you're intending to use this particular thing that you're building, where does it fit in the spectrum of things that can be regulated? When we talk about devices, as I said before, it's all dependent upon what the intended use of the device is, and also how we describe what the device is actually doing and what its technological characteristics are. And then based upon those two criteria, the level of regulatory control from the agency that is going to be given for that particular product will be decided. And we have three different classes: class 1, class 2, and class 3. And as you go up in risk of the device, you go to a higher class. And the other thing we have to mention here is that basically, like, we use something called product codes or pro codes, which is allowing us to group similar devices together and make sure that we can sort of build a family of devices where they are doing the same intended use. And so you can, if you look at a product code, you can tell what are the devices that have been cleared under that product code. So I believe that this is going to be a lot of new concepts coming to you, because I used to be the NIH, and when I moved the NIH to FDA, the language changes of how we speak about scientific things, if I may say that. So here, just it may be a little bit confusing as a lot of new definitions come your way. Just be patient, and you can go back and listen to the talk and get more understanding of what actually these concepts mean. So this slide reiterates some of the points I mentioned in the previous slide. And the key thing to note here, as I said, like classes 1, 2, and 3, and the risk level is increasing at the higher class. But the main thing here is, what are the controls, right? We have something called regulatory controls that are applicable to a product area. And these are allowing us to provide consistent requirements to make sure that we have predictable, safe, and effective medical devices, and we have appropriate level of regulatory oversight on these devices. And so these controls are generally broad, but maybe specific. And at the bottom, I've listed the general controls, which are applicable even to the lowest class devices, which is basically like you have to provide labeling for your device. Then you have to do medical device reporting. For example, if there are device-related injuries or deaths, you have to report that to the agency. Then you have to register your establishment with the agency, and then you have to have a device listing, and like you could have like global device IDs approach, and then your quality systems that you have to have in place, make sure that the devices are safe and effective. And finally, obviously, you have to make sure that we can track adulteration and misbranding concepts. And these are the type of submission types that we get to see within these different classes. And this basically, for a moderate risk, you typically will see a 510K more than any other type of submission. You will see some de novo submissions too, but most of the time it'll be a 510K or exempt submission. Then when you go to the highest risk device, you'll pretty much end up with something called a pre-market approval or a PMA device, which will have the highest amount of regulatory control on those devices. When you look at class 2 devices, besides the general control, we also have something called special controls. And basically what we see here on the left is they're specific only to class 2 devices, not for class 1 devices. And they're not typically common, but basically applicable for well-established device types. And when you're looking for example of where is a special control applied, then you can look at when you look at the Code of Federal Regulation, and you look at the B section of that particular product, it'll tell you like, okay, what is the classification? What are the special controls that are applicable to this particular device? And if you look at I've given some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the example special controls that are placed on these devices, because they are a little bit higher risk than like a class 1 device, but they're obviously not as high risk as a class 3 device. So you can have requirements when you're coming in with your pre-market submission, like you need to provide design or characteristics or specifications. Then you need to provide testing. You may need special labeling, and there are some guidance documents you have to go through to make sure that your device satisfies those special controls, or before it can be allowed to be authorized to be going out into market in the US. So here, this is a very simplistic and brief outline of the steps for bringing a new product to market in the US through the FDA. And I think the most important part in this particular slide is the link at the bottom, because I think CDRH Learn would be a very valuable asset for if you're bringing a device to market in the US, because it walks you through in fairly simple approach and logic that how you can, and explains all the process aspects for bringing a device to the market in the US, and what are the various aspects of how you do research, how you get your data together, how you make sure that your quality control process is in place, how you make sure you verify and validate your device's operation. And so some of those things will be more easily explained in that site. And this slide doesn't do justice to the expansive aspect of this thing. But very briefly going over the slide, what you start out, this is pretty much sequentially what you want to do is like, first of all, you want to establish your product. Make sure that its description and the intended use, the indications for use, the duration of use, like how long should we use, and the target population. Like for example, it could be age range, which you want it, what age range is it applicable for, what type of populations, what disease is it applicable for, those kind of things. You want to get that clear first. And then you want to go to like, you want to verify that this product is actually a medical device. Remember, as I said, the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act tells us like what is a device. And so once you define your intended use, does that fit within that particular definition or not? And where does it fit in that scope? And then once you've done that, like you want to find the classification regulatory pathway. Is it going to be class 1, class 2, class 3? And which particular pathway do you want to go down based upon the risk? It'll tell you. Once you have figured out that these are the things I have to do, then you then go ahead and build your evidence for your scientific evidence, make sure that you can come in with the pre-market submission. What I would strongly encourage any of you who's interested in bringing a device to market is work with the FDA as early as possible, because the earlier you get us involved in your process development of, even from like, once you establish that this is what you want to do, you can come in and talk to us and say, okay, this is my intended use, where do I fit in your scope of controls? And it might be something as simple as saying, okay, your device we don't, or you're a product we don't regulate. In which case you might have a different pathway versus we say, okay, you're a high risk product because you're doing X, Y, and Z. And so having that conversation right at the bat, I think it's going to be very valuable, rather than waiting till you're up at step 5 and then coming and talking to us and then realizing you have to go back and redo a lot of the things because you totally misinterpreted what regulatory systems are. So talk to our review divisions as much as possible, and you can I'll provide an email address to reach out to us, and we can connect you with the review divisions which are appropriate for your particular product. But please do work with us as early as possible rather than waiting till the end. But when you talk about devices, then the question becomes, how does that apply in the scope of digital health? And it gets very interesting when you talk about devices in digital health spectrum. So we start out on this initial definition, right, which is saying the Section 201H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a definition for device. And any product that's not within that spectrum is going to be something that we consider not a device. So, okay, that's clean and easy. But then the nuance that kicks in is that we have the 21st Century Cures Act that came in and said that, okay, when you're thinking about software functions, there are some parts of software functions that should not be considered as a device, that should be regulated by the FDA. And so once you start thinking about that aspect, then you realize that there are a lot of software solutions or software functions that you can develop which don't necessarily have to come to the FDA, and you can go straight to market. And so this is the first guidance, I think, which is listed at the bottom here, which we call the 3060 guidance. And basically what it is doing is it's listing the changes that apply to existing medical software policies because of this Cures Act. And as you can see here from left to right, like there are a lot of these software functions that it talks about, which it says that these are software functions that do not need to be regulated by the FDA. And so I'll be going into more detail into these different software functions as you go forward. But think about when you're building a product, like where does it fit in the spectrum? Does it fit in these kind of sort of buckets or not? And then that's where you go from, like how when you talk to the FDA also. And in the previous slide, I mentioned the word function. And I want to make sure that when we talk about function within the agency or within like a pre-market space or in the authorization space, we have a different meaning than like a mathematical function, right? So in here, we are talking about a distinct purpose of a product. And so when we talk about function, a device function, basically it's a function that meets the definition of a device. So that's something that we can potentially regulate. And then when we say device software function, we're talking about a software function that meets the device definition. So you want to be careful that when we say function here, we're talking about how does this thing function? What does it do? And basically as it goes back to the point I raised at the beginning of this talk, which is like the whole thing hinges on intended use of the product. What is the product doing? So the intended use is a function of that particular product, and you can have multiple intended uses. And so, for example, if you just are having one intended use, which is analyzing the data, then it's only one function, which is analyze the data. On the other hand, if it's intended to store, transfer, and analyze, then it has three different functions, right? It has a function to store, it has a function to transfer, and it has a function that will analyze the data that's come through it and do something with it, right? So you want to be careful that when you start to build your product, you have to think about what are the functions of this product and which basically translates to what are the intended uses of this product. And then you can go down the pathway of saying, okay, is this a device function or it's not a device function? And so when we talk about not a device function sort of thing, we talk about other functions, and I'll come back to this later, but basically it's a function that does not meet the definition of a device. So it can be an intended use, but it might be an intended use that doesn't fit under Section 201H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so, or it could be something like it could be an exempt kind of function. So you want to be careful about the nuances that apply to any of the functions of a device. And so when we're looking at which functions are being reviewed by the FDA, then it'll be called device function review, and so on and so forth. So obviously, I'm not suggesting that you memorize all this, and you shouldn't, but it's a slide that I put up. We can go back and look at it, and these are definitions that are available on the FDA website, and you can look at them and understand the nuances of how things are looked at when they come into the agency. The other thing I was also going to mention is when you think about the intended use, which I've been sort of mentioning all along, is like we had an amendment to this intended use through the 21 CFR Code of Federal Regulation 801, where basically like there was some aspect related to, okay, how do you define intended use, right? How do you know what the product's intended use is? And so here we provided more clarity and direction regarding what type of evidence can be used to determine its intended use. And so we can use any relevant source of evidence, which can include direct evidence you might have supplied or to us when you submitted your application, or like indirect or circumstantial evidence, such as how you're selling the product in the marketplace. And courts have recognized that self-serving labels cannot be used or cannot be allowed to mask the vendor's true intent as indicated by the overall circumstances. So the intended use can be determined using these different approaches to truly understanding whether the person or the device manufacturer or product manufacturers, how are they trying to sell this device, or what is it being sold for? So going back to the regulatory classification question, when you talk about digital health products, where does a particular digital health product sit is dependent upon the risk categorization of that device and the intended use of the device. So it can either be not a device we are looking at. Remember, a device is not a product. A device is something the FD&C Act, or we can intend to use exercise something called enforcement discretion, and I'll come to that in the future, in the next subsequent slide. Or it'll be under the regulatory oversight of the FDA, in which case it's a different pathway it goes down. So when you look at software functions, right, and basically, like if it's a software function, we want to look at how it's regulated, and you can see at the bottom there's an arrow which goes increasing risk. And basically, as I said in the previous slide, as the risk of a device increases, the risk of the intended use of the device increases, then the more oversight comes into play from the FDA's perspective. And so if you're on the left-hand side of the risk flow, then you're basically looking at functions that are intended for like log, record. So this is an example, right? In which case we're saying that you can either log, record, track, evaluate, or make decisions or behavioral suggestions, but there's no reference to a disease or a condition in this particular example. On the other hand, if you start adding more information, like we're trying to help smokers quit, or you want to help patients recovering from addiction, or you're developing apps for pregnant women, then these are apps where the risk level is higher, and then the agency has an intent to exercise enforcement discretion depending upon where the risk sits on that particular profile for those particular devices. And finally, then if you're looking at a product where you're building a software function that uses sensors or leads to track, measure, and display like electrical signal like ECG, then those are higher risk products. And so we definitely have regulatory oversight on those products. So in order to help industry and consumers get clarity on the regulatory aspects related to software, CDRH has released a number of guidance documents over the last few years, as I've shown here. Some of these are in draft state, which means that they're not considered final guidances, and they're currently either accepting public comment or we are evaluating comments that have been provided by the public after the commenting period is closed, and the final guidance will be published sometime soon. But definitely these are documents that are can be sometimes difficult to read and understand, but can be they're very valuable in helping you understand how the agency is interpreting authorizations or congressional authorizations provided to it. I think the key tool that you may want to start out with is something called the Digital Health Policy Navigator. This is something that the Digital Health Center of Excellence recently made available. It's on our FDA's website. And this is mainly to help product developers understand how their software function fits within the regulatory framework of the agency. It's an interactive workflow, and you basically answer different questions, which are shown here, like different steps. And based upon how we answer these questions, it's a rule-based system where it basically takes you down different pathways, and it tells you like, okay, based upon how we answered a particular set of questions, you will either be likely not be a medical device, or it could be a device or a product where enforcement discretion applies, or a device where you have to come in and talk to us and have regulatory oversight on that. And so, and it's a nice starting point. But it's not the be all and end all. So just because it tells you one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't come and talk to us. But I think it's a good starting point to tell you where you are in that spectrum of which guidance is applied to your particular device. So I want to do a deeper dive into some of the aspects related to software functions that we have talked about. And so I'm going to start with more of the functions that we don't have, the FDA doesn't have kind of considered as devices. And so this is coming from the Section 520.01A of the FD&C Act. And basically any software function that you build, which is for administrative support of a healthcare facility, those types of functions are historically not considered to be devices by the agency. And so I provided some examples here where basically if you're tracking financial records, claims of billing information, or if you're looking at building scheduling for your medical staff, or if you're building a software for like analyzing historical claims data for cost effectiveness, or looking at health benefit eligibility, those are the functions that the FDA doesn't get in look at as devices. This is not to say that any other regulatory agency within the federal government may or may not have an opinion on how these functions are deployed, but from the FDA perspective, this is not something we look at. Then the second one, I think, is an interesting one for digital health, because we will see a lot of products out there that make a large number of general or vague claims about health. So when we talk about general wellness, we are basically considering two different types of products. So one is that either they're intended for only general wellness use as defined in the guidance for general wellness, and they present a lower risk to the safety of the users and other persons. And basically what we're saying here is that we do not intend to examine low risk general wellness products. And basically the thing becomes like, how are you defining these kind of risk, low risk, and general wellness? And so one of the ways, if you look at the guidance, there are two categories that we talk about when we talk about low risk. And if your product is making claims about sustaining or offering general improvement to functions associated with the general state of health and do not make any reference to a disease or condition, then that's one category of general wellness. On the other hand, if you're talking about making reference to disease or condition, you're only making intended use claims of sustaining or offering general improvement to functions associated with the general state of health. And so basically we're talking about relationship between healthy lifestyle choices and sustaining a general state of health. So think about these aspects when you are trying to think whether your product's intended use is general wellness or not. And so when you are in that space, I would recommend, again, as I said before, come and talk to us. The next one I want to talk about is electronic health records. And this is an interesting area of focus, basically, that under the Section 520.01C of the FD&C Act, some software functions that are intended to serve as electronic patient records are not considered as devices. And so these are three different conditions that apply. They have to be met. And the first two, I think the third one is the most interesting one. And basically, the first one basically says if you're creating it for people like healthcare professionals or individuals working under healthcare professional supervision are the ones looking at or creating or storing or reviewing these kind of records. They also have to be part of like an ONC, Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, based upon the Public Health Service Act 3001 CF. And so if it's under that program, and the third thing which is important is to note that these should not be intended for interpretation or analysis of patient records, including like medical image data, for the purpose of diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treating of disease or condition. And if you remember this, the last part of the language actually comes from the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, right? Where we talk about the intended use of this particular function and where does it fit in. So if you're using that particular function for these kind of activities, then yes, that would be a device because of it's doing diagnosis, cure, and all that other potential possibilities. The other thing to mention about the EHR is that basically at this time there's some overlap with, I think I mentioned the second criteria, that there's overlap with the ONC, which is part of the statutory definition of this particular process. And so even after you establish that a product is an EHR, you have to be careful. The fact is that when you're talking about product functions, that just because you have an EHR function does not mean that other functions of your device are not, or of your product are not a device, right? So you want to be careful about, you might have one function which is EHR, but there might be another function which might be doing something which can be considered as a device by the FDA. So you want to consider all these functions separately, and also you want to evaluate that anything that you add new functionality to your product, see how that impacts within that FD&C Act. And again, going back to the 3060 Act, 3060 guidance, you want to look at how the different criteria are describing electronic health records for healthcare professionals. And we also said that in the second bullet, we're talking about like how if it enables patients, individuals, or non-healthcare providers to create, store, or transfer health records, they are considered personal health records. So these are not meant for, as I said before, because they're not meant for intended use of diagnosis, cure, mitigation, and so on and so forth. They would also not be considered devices under the FD&C Act, Section 201H. Going on to the next guidance. This one is interesting one because it's talking about medical device. It's a pretty long name for the guidance, which is basically talking about medical device data systems, medical image storage devices, and medical image communications devices. And we have a short acronym for that. It's called MDDS. And basically, these are hardware or software products that are mainly intended to transfer, store, convert formats, and display medical device data. The key here is that the MDDS cannot or does not modify the data or modify the display of the data, and does not control the functional parameters. So like, for example, if you think about a hardware device, a router would be considered a hardware device. It just transfers data from one point A to point B, and it doesn't modify the data or modify the display of the data, and does not control the functional parameters of any other medical device. So it depends on how you look at it, and it's very valuable to think about your device, whether it's an MDDS or non-MDDS. And so when I think about MDDS system, we have software functions and we have hardware functions. And so each of these can be considered differently. And if it's a software function that just transfers, stores, or converts format and doesn't do all the modifications or control, then it's not a device and it won't be subject to our regulatory requirements. Similarly, when you think about hardware functions that again do the same kind of activity or actions, then those are considered as device MDDS, and for certain device MDDS, we do not intend to enforce the requirements. The next interesting part, as you transition from like general wellness to MDDS to clinical decision support systems, this is an interesting area because there's a lot of action we're seeing from artificial intelligence and machine learning related to clinical decision support systems. And so CDS is basically a tool that allows healthcare professionals and patients to get more information and to filter that and have it presented to them at appropriate time to ensure that health and healthcare is delivered correctly. So the key is obviously we want to make sure that these are all safe and effective. And there are a lot of different aspects of CDS, as you can see here, like you can range from like clinical guidelines to developing diagnostic support or having contextually relevant reference information. So this field is pretty big and broad. And we have the Cures Act has talked about like the 520-01E. The FD&C Act has also provided some information like as to how do we decide whether the particular CDS is something that should be considered as a device or can be excluded from the device function. And so there are 4 statutory criteria that have been defined in this particular section of the Act, which are allowing us to determine whether a particular function becomes a device or non-device. And so when we talk about non-device, we're talking about basically those functions that do not meet the definition of device, right, that we talked about before. And the other thing is like, when you talk about functions which are excluded from device definition, we have to be clear that these are independent of the platform that they're being run on. So it could be running on as Android or an iOS. It doesn't matter. It does. These functions are excluded from device definition independent of that. So these are the 4 criteria from the Cures Act, right? And so the key here is that all 4 conditions have to be met. So if you look at it, you start from the first one and go down the rank that way. And basically the first 2 are basic input kind of aspects. Basically you're saying that is it intended to acquire, process, analyze a medical image? Or the second one is intended for displaying something. And then the last one mainly looking from the output perspective, like is it providing intended to provide recommendation? And finally, is it like intended for enabling a healthcare professional independently review the basis of such recommendations? So any CDS software that you develop, it has to meet all 4 conditions to be excluded from the device definition. So it can be a little hard to make sure that you hit all 4 of them. This cartoon sketch or graphic outline, which is available online on the FDA's website, is sort of like a cheat sheet of how this process works. And so the top row is basically saying that if it meets all these 4 criteria that are shown here, then that particular one would be considered as a non-device CDS. But if it fails any of them, then you are pretty much a device and we will be regulating you. And so, for example, if you look at device example, if you're looking at in vitro diagnostics or looking at MRI and next-gen sequencing, those kind of functions are failing this particular step 1, right? And then you go to like step 2 where you're looking at like ECG or looking at medical images, and then the question becomes, okay, how are you looking at those kind of information? And then the other examples here looking at like risk score for disease or conditions and probability of a disease or a condition that you might have, and then finally time critical outputs is something that we always are concerned about. And finally, like here we look at if your AI, for example, if your AI algorithm is not providing the basis of the recommendation that it provides you as to why a particular action is justified to be taken, and if the clinician cannot understand why that's being done, then that's something that we would want to see as a device. Going further down, we're talking about policy for device software functions in mobile medical applications, or as we call it, the DSF MMA guidance. And this is an interesting guidance because it's a fairly broad guidance, and it's very useful reading to understand what kind of aspects of digital health come under the different umbrellas of whether it's a device or it comes under enforcement discretion or whether it's regulated by the FDA. And so I think it's a very useful starting point when you're starting to look at digital health products, like which guidance do you want to start with. I think I would recommend this particular guidance. It's all our guidance is obviously well written, but this I think feels like a very nicely collected guidance, and it's sort of like a first go-to guidance when we have any example or a question come into us about a digital health inquiry, and then we say, okay, how did we interpret it in this particular guidance? I think if you're starting out in the field, it's a good guidance to start out with. And some of the other aspects related to this particular guidance is, besides the fact that it defines some of these functions, it also talks about like we do not regulate the sale or general use of consumer use of smartphones or tablets. And so this was one of the things I think comes easy output from this guidance. But I think, as I mentioned before, the main things that are relevant here is the fact that we're talking about where are the regulatory oversights that have been established through this guidance. We're talking about basically we're talking about which software functions are medical devices or not medical devices, and which are the ones where we intend to exercise enforcement discretion. And the right-hand side talks about what do we mean by enforcement discretion, right? Basically, we're saying that even if it meets the definition of medical device, we do not intend to exercise enforcement. Like basically, like we believe that these functions are posing lower risk to the public based upon the evidence we have in the field or from scientific literature. And so generally, we intend to exercise enforcement discretion for several different types of examples. And if it's something that's helping a patient self-manage the disease or condition without providing specific treatment or treatment suggestions, then we definitely are looking in that space. And so I list two here, but this is not exhaustive. And if you can go back to that guidance and look at the different examples and different scenarios that have been laid out of how enforcement policy is implemented in those conditions. I think that would be a good guidance to look through. The last one I want to talk about is something called the multiple function guidance. And this is when you think about a product which has multiple functions, remember we talk about, when you say functions, we talk about intended use. And so depending on different intended use, this guidance gives you clarity about how we look at the other functions, right? And so if you look at the right-hand side, we talk about what's another function, right? It doesn't meet the definition of a device, or if it meets it, then there's some kind of exemption that's applicable, or if it's meeting the definition, but has some kind of intent, the FDA has expressed intent not to enforce compliance. And so when you talk about these kind of other functions as being part of a device itself, then how does the FDA look at those particular functions? And this particular multiple function guidance walks you through some of those aspects. So just because they're part of a multiple function device doesn't mean we want to look at it. On the other hand, we will look at how this particular other function impacts the device function that we're actually interested in, right? So you want to make sure that the device function that you're reviewing are not, their safety and effectiveness is not impacted by this other function that you have sitting on the side. So for example, if you have a general purpose computing platform, we don't regulate that, but we are interested to know how does that general purpose computing platform that you're using for your app, which is sitting on top of that, how does that interaction work, and how are you ensuring that your app is safe and effective when there are issues or aspects related to the general purpose computing platform. So we would ask for that kind of connection to be established. And so similarly for the hardware, that if you are looking at intragastric balloon, which is subject to a PMA or pre-market approval, and you have an endoscope accessory that is 510K exempt, for example, an endoscope guide wire, we may still want to see how this guide wire impacts the safety and effectiveness of the balloon. So in that sense, you have to be careful that when you look at devices with multiple functions, how do the other functions interact with your function that you're actually coming to the agency with for authorization. So basically, if you look through the guidance, it'll talk you through, like, you want to do a risk assessment, right? And so when you do a risk assessment, you want to see what the other function impacts as well as the device function that review. If there's a positive impact, like it improves safety and effectiveness, right? For example, increased GPUs or higher neural net or something like that, then it obviously improves processing speed, but it has something that we want to look at. And also you want to see if there's an adverse effect, right? If it's, for example, you added some kind of lower capacity RAM or something like that, in which case obviously your computational time slows down. And so we would like to know what kind of, or if you added a software library which has slower computation or it was not updated for a while, then in which case those functions can impact adversely. And so you want to know how does that particular function, even though it's not necessarily something we would have looked at, but the question becomes, how does it impact the safety and effectiveness of the device function that we are looking at? And then, so once you've considered all those aspects of risk assessment, then you need to include that in a pre-market submission that tells us how these other functions impact the device function that review. And you mainly do that when you're either positively impacting, and you're going to show that for the function the review, and or if it's negatively impacting the device function the review. So I know this is a whirlwind tour of digital health at CDRH, and Jack has my slides and this information. And as I said, CDRH Learn is a great site to go to learn more about how we look at different devices and how we regulate them. I want to conclude by just summarizing some of the aspects I hit on during this talk, which is basically saying, like, when you talk about software function, it's a device if it's intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease or condition. And so the vocabulary we use is we call them device software functions. So remember, the word device has its own meaning, and then we talk about software functions that are meeting this device definition. So that's how we define software functions. And then when you look at the 21st Century Cures Act, there's some software functions that are excluded from definition of a device. So, and we have, as I walked you through several of our guidances, these can help you understand, okay, whether your particular product is coming under that or not, right? And so that help you understand like whether you need to walk through all the different aspects or not. But I think at this end of the day, having good quality control systems in your processes as you build your product is going to be always valuable, even if it's a device not authorized, not coming under FDA purview. I think for success of your product and your company, I think it's valuable for you to build good quality control systems within your product development processes. So that's something I would encourage. And then when you look at regulatory oversight, we're looking at primarily software functions that are medical devices, and we're looking at risk categorization. If its functionality failure would impact the safety of the patient, then it's something we're really interested and want to oversee from a regulatory perspective. And as I mentioned towards the last few slides, that we recognize that there are products that have more than one function or more than one intended use. And so the question becomes like, you want to make sure that when your other functions, how are those other functions impacting the function that you're looking at from a regulatory perspective? And you want to make sure that we look at both positive and negative aspects of those other functions. And the last thing I want to point out is like, there are several ways you can reach out to us. We have the digital health inbox, which is as shown here, digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov. We have a number of guidance documents that we have released. And we also have regulatory tools such as the Digital Health Policy Navigator, and also CDRH Learn is another valuable tool which you can use to get to understand how you bring your product to market in the US. So this is the last slide. And basically, if you have any questions, you can either reach out to digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov, or you can email me also directly if you need to. Thank you.
Vinay, thank you so much. This stuff you talked about here, I think will be of a lot of interest to many folks who are parts of our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab, and generally speaking, a lot of at least the work that we're familiar with through our interactions with the community from where we sit here at UVA have been in the space of developing computational algorithms that are linked to some sort of biometric device. And so what you're talking about here, where there's the device itself and there's the software, there's the interaction between the two, I think this is exactly the kind of information that people who have these, if they're looking at cardiac function, or they're basically looking at the eye, for example, or they're making some other metric like with a wearable device and they want to market it, that this is the kind of information they need.
Definitely. And I think the one thing I mentioned at the beginning, and I will keep hammering away at it because we have discussions within the agency also, like any developer of a software should come and talk to us as early as possible. And we are friendly, we are nice to talk to. And so please do reach out early. Don't wait till the last minute. And then it's a lot of investment. When you build startups, it's a lot of upfront investment. So you want to make sure that at a minimum, you're on the right path for this particular product.
I think that's very, very good advice. One of the things that I wanted to ask about is, and we were sort of talking a little bit about this before we got started today, but you brought it up several times and you really kind of iterated on it about how much terms matter and the definitions of these words that perhaps those of us who don't know any better would use interchangeably. But you point out rightly so that that there is a difference between a device and a product, and you gave several other several resources for people to look at to avoid confusion. Are there any common mistakes that people make in mixing up terms that could they might use in one context but to the FDA means something else?
I have to come back and look at, because I'm pretty sure there are now, I've been so immersed in the FDA approach of thinking about things, like sometimes it's hard. Like I think I mentioned before the call, like the word signal has a different meaning within FDA connotations. And I think also like words like monitoring or, so post-market is an interesting space where we look at how devices perform in the real world. And so some of those aspects related to how devices are monitored or tracked can be meaning different things for different agencies. And so I think that's one aspect. I think the device and product is the most obvious one, I think, because we have a clear, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is clearly defined for us what that means, and those words have specific meanings. And I think the other place where we have had aspects related to that is in AI/ML, because especially when you talk about bias trying to understand different types of bias, like statistical bias versus systemic bias, and understanding explainability of an algorithm. Those are some of the nuances that are different from different perspectives, not just within the agencies, but also even in the academic community as to understanding what those particular words mean. And I think one thing I was going to mention is that we have something called the IMDRF, which is International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and we have started to build glossary of words, and so that we all understand when we're saying a particular word that we're talking about the same thing. And sometimes it can get lost that we may be talking about the same word, but we're talking about totally different concepts. And then it takes a while to get back to the same space.
Yeah, I think that's probably super important, just to have a thesaurus of what those terms are. One of the things that occurred to me as you were mentioning about evidence and that word and what that means is the evidence that one needs to provide in their application, is it in narrative form only, or is there an expectation of a live demonstration in front of an FDA representative that your device does what it says it does?
So it's mostly been the former, but we also had situations where it has helped us understand more about what a device does by having a demonstration. Obviously, I mean, it's not a requirement, so it's up to the. So when we use the word sponsor, a company coming in to submit to us is called a sponsor, right? They're sponsoring the product to come in for review. And so when a sponsor comes in and they show us a video or they show us their product, it makes it a lot easier to connect the dots between what you're seeing on paper versus what you're actually seeing in demonstration. And so we have had several examples of when we look at a submission and say, oh, are you doing X, Y, and Z? And then we have a conversation with the sponsor and they show us a demonstration of what the product does. And we realize, aha, it does X, but it doesn't do Y. And its intended use is not this, but it's the other thing. And so it's been always helpful to us to have a demonstration or a video. And obviously, with the pandemic and all, it's been hard to have a hands-on demo, but you can do a video presentation about your product. But part of the thing is also we don't want to put undue burden on the sponsor, saying that if somebody cannot do a video, it doesn't mean they should be impaired from having their device looked at like the right circumstances. So it's not a requirement, but it definitely helps to understand where you're coming from as a device manufacturer.
That's great. And a lot of people, I imagine in this day and age, we've sort of gotten used to it, is with wearable devices and things that you can wear on your wrist or on your head or on your finger for that matter, are internet enabled, and they have Bluetooth technology attached to them. They connect to your cell phone or they connect to the internet in some shape or form. And I'm curious if the FDA works with other agencies for where necessary, for example, like the Federal Communications Commission, when you're dealing with things that involve, say, wireless or wired communication technologies. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we do work with FCC and FTC, and obviously we do work with ONC and CMS. So we do all work with the different agencies. But if it's just one particular product that we're looking at, the review of that product is typically done in-house only. We don't necessarily go outside. We also have something called a network of experts. For digital health, we call it NODEX, which is Network of Digital Health Experts. And so we use these network of experts to help understand if you have questions about some scientific aspect of things. So we reach out to them and have these broad, not product specific, but like fairly broad questions about like, okay, in this particular field, these are the kind of questions we have, how would you answer that? And so that's one way we do it. And we do work with FCC and FTC, like Federal Trade Commission, and to understand like what are the kind of broad ranging aspects or different technologies that we have to think about, especially like when it's low energy Bluetooth and trying to understand the security implications. So we have a separate division within CDRH looking at cybersecurity aspect of different devices, and which is a very strongly, it's a very strong topic of interest for the agency because of the various aspects of how safety and effectiveness of devices can be impaired by hacks and legacy devices being sort of unprotected. So we had a lot of interest in that space, and yeah, we do talk to other agencies on that front.
You sort of predicted my next question, which was what are one of the things that, or any of the things that, because I think you touched on it, but you didn't really go into the details because you were talking about other things, but about subject and patient privacy. Certainly with you're developing a device, perhaps it's, linked to you in some way, and yet it's, sending information over the internet. Are there any things that you look at specifically to help make sure that data that's transmitted is private, or, that PHI is removed? I don't know what some of the other things might be, but I'm curious about how you address those.
So I think it depends. So for almost all our product questions, the answer is always it depends, right? And so if the company needs that PHI information to make diagnosis, like if it's a class 3 product or a product where there's a patient-specific recommendation being made, then obviously they want to have that connectivity to the patient. So from that perspective, the company has to be responsible and has to show in the documentation to submit to us how they're protecting the patient information, how are they making sure that confidentiality is ensured. We as an agency don't see that information because that's obviously not part of the submission that comes to us, but it's basically like making sure that the company knows how that it has to protect the information. It has to be enforcing these aspects related to how the patients feel about using the devices. And when we talk about safety and effectiveness, we also think about like human factors, right? Like when we talk about AR, VR devices, we want to understand like how are the human factors looked at when you're looking at these devices. And again, they are the confidentiality of information about like surgeons. You want to understand, make sure that you're looking at data in an appropriate way and making sure the data is protected. So definitely, yeah, that's something we do strongly work with the vendors to make sure that they have it under control from that angle.
That's great. Well, Vinay, we've reached the end of our time, but thank you so much for sharing this with us. This is really valuable information, and I think it's important because it comes from some place that, we don't, at least in our history here in the Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab activities, we haven't really heard from the FDA before. And so thank you for sharing this with us, because I know for a fact there's lots of people who are interested in this space and productizing, rather not productizing, but they're basically taking their devices and their other research products and marketing them, and having the help of you and folks at the FDA would really be valuable for them.
Cool.
Thank you very, very much, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.
Thanks.